I'm Catherine Norlock, and I'm the Associate Dean of Humanities and Social Sciences at Trent University and the Kenneth Mark Drain Chair in Ethics. I'm here because, and we are all here because, we are gathered at Trent University on the traditional territory of the Mississauga, Anishinaabe, to hear the Harry Kitchen Lecture. We're grateful to the First Nations of this region for sharing their knowledge and working with us to tell their stories. On behalf of Trent University, which is celebrating its 60th anniversary, it is my honor to welcome you to the annual Harry Kitchen Lecture in Public Policy. Since its beginning 60 years ago, Trent has strived to be a strong partner to our community and to contribute to the culture of Peterborough and our region. Sharing knowledge, as we do tonight, is just one way we give back to our community. This lecture is part of the university's Community Speaker Series that hosts lectures on campus and in community settings on some of the most pressing topics of our times. All of the lectures are open to the public and free to attend thanks to the generosity of philanthropy. And tonight's lecture is thanks to the generosity of Professor Harry Kitchen. Harry is a well-respected economist who has written extensively on issues related to municipal economies and policies. He has served as a consultant and advisor for governments and private sector institutions. Among his many honors, Harry was awarded the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal for contributions to research on municipal finance and governance. Upon his retirement in 2007, he was named Professor Emeritus, and his colleagues and friends recognized his contributions to both Trent and to the field of public policy by establishing this lecture series. The objective of this annual lecture is to provide Trent University students and the wider community access to experts in the field of economics and public policy. On behalf of Trent University and the Peterborough community, thank you, Harry, for your vision and dedication and for the legacy you have left our university. We're fortunate to have Harry with us here tonight, and I'd like to invite him to introduce tonight's speaker. Harry Kitchen, everyone.
Thanks, Kate. Well, I would like to start by saying I think the real impetus behind this lecture series was not me, it was Torben, who's here tonight. And he was chair of the department when I retired, and he orchestrated it, got it rolling. And I have to say that he did a tremendous job in developing a speakers list. And I was just talking to Chris about it before he came in, and we have had a really good group of speakers over the years, and Byron has picked it up since Torben retired. So basically the credit goes to the two of them rather than to me. I would like to just make a few comments about Chris. There's a description of what he's done on the website. I won't go through a lot of it. He's had a number of distinguished positions. He's currently at McGill University, Associate Professor of Macroeconomics and Public Policy. And some of you will remember that 2 years ago, Bill Watson, who was also retired from McGill, was here and gave the lecture series. He was what I thought was a really remarkable report that the Fiscal Commission put out back, I think it was about 2015, Chris, and Chris chaired it. It was a group of economists, a bunch of advisors got together and wrote a report. Primarily, a lot of it was to deal with carbon pricing, and I thought it was an absolutely outstanding piece of work. And of course, he was recognized for that in an award he won from the Canadian Economics Association. I believe it was the Doug Purvis Prize. So he's also had the David Dodge Chair in Monetary Policy at the C.D. Howe Institute, and David Dodge gave the lecture by, I think it was during the pandemic. He was a participant here. C.D. Howe Institute, Bill Robson has been a participant in the lecture series in the past few years. Also Kevin Page, who's Parliamentary Budgetary Officer, was here, and Mike Horrigan, I guess he was Deputy Finance Minister at the time. And a lot of these people were, of course, attributed to Torben's involvement and familiarity with him. I don't think I'll go through and spend a lot of time. I'd rather hear Chris talk about what he has to say. But I got a bit of an indication of what we might hear tonight when I read an opinion piece in the Globe and Mail last week, and Chris was heavily cited in terms of debt policy and fiscal policy and deficits. And I suspect we're going to hear a fair amount about that tonight. It's also noteworthy that Kevin Page was cited about 1 day earlier or 1 day later on roughly the same thing. And Kevin Page was, of course, a person who gave the lecture here a few years ago. So it's been, in my view, I think it's quite a distinguished list of speakers we've had. And I do really think we should thank Byron and Torben for putting it together. So Chris, I would like to invite you up.
Thank you very much. Dawn, am I on and this is good? All right. So thank you very much, Byron, and for the department for inviting me. And delighted to be here for a Harry Kitchen lecture. And I was looking a few days ago at the list of the past speakers, and it's like I'd be hard pressed to come up with a different list for my favorite economists, actually. So I was a special advisor at the Bank of Canada to David Dodge. I kind of think of David Dodge as my governor. And Mike Horgan was the Deputy Minister of Finance when I was the Clifford Clark economist at Finance in 2009-10. And Don Drummond and Kevin Page. So I'm very, very happy to be here adding to that list. What am I talking about? Well, keeping our fiscal powder dry. It actually had this title before Chrystia Freeland resigned. So if you remember that day back in December something or other, when Chrystia Freeland resigned, wrote a letter and published her letter on Twitter, the letter that she wrote resigning, the letter to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. She talked about, it was quite a scolding letter, if you remember that. And one of the things she talked about was the need to avoid sort of fiscal gimmicks, I think was the word she used, and the need to keep our fiscal powder dry. And so what this talk is about is what it means to keep our fiscal powder dry. It's not actually motivated by her letter. This talk has existed before she resigned, but it is absolutely motivated by, the need to pay a little bit more attention to our fiscal situation. So just in case you kind of fall asleep and wake up toward the end. By the way, how much time do I have?
As much time as you want, but we like a little time for Q&A.
Oh, we need lots of time for Q&A. But we have 90 minutes total?
90 minutes.
Oh, excellent. Okay. Just in case you fall asleep, this is what the basic storyline is. So stay awake for this slide and then the next slide. Then you can fall asleep and then you can come back for Q&A. So, number one, genuine crises happen every once in a while. Governments should, notice the red and underline, should use their borrowing power to address these issues. I'm very much going to give you a talk that my view is a believer in government using its power to address serious problems when they occur, okay? So it is not an anti-government spiel at all. But it is saying that if government is going to want to use its fiscal power to address crises, it needs to be able to borrow on a large scale every once in a while. And that will only be possible if the bonds that it's issuing are viewed as, things that are likely to be repaid. So they've got to be viewed as safe assets. And following a crisis, after you've borrowed a bunch to deal with it, prudence requires getting that debt ratio. So I'm going to talk about the net debt to GDP ratio back to a safe level, and I'll talk about what I mean by a safe level. And the punchline, I suppose, is I actually think Canadian governments, and I'm going to talk about federal and provincial governments all combined, are probably being a little bit too complacent or imprudent today. Especially, now I would say this even before the election and before the threats that we are now, the economic and I suppose political threats that we are now receiving from the United States, or at least from the US president. So I think that message applied before that, but I think it especially applies now in the face of those threats and the uncertainty associated with it. I'm going to motivate this graph through the course of the talk, but this is kind of the graph I'm going to end with. So there's the provincial debt to GDP ratio, the federal debt to GDP ratio, and the sum of the two, and I'm going to focus on the sum of the two. And what I'm going to do is motivate the red, yellow, and green area, okay? The red area, as suggested by the color, is going to be we want to avoid ever getting into the red area. Yellow is close to red, so it's not so good. Green is far away from red, so it's good, okay? That's where I'm going, okay? And I will tell you the boundaries I'm going to give you between red, yellow, and green are going to be those boundaries, but I'll motivate them through the course of this talk. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you 5 premises that I think are pretty hard to disagree with. You may disagree with any one or maybe all of my premises, in which case you can raise that question and we can fight about them. But I think the 5 premises are pretty hard to debate. And those 5 premises get me to this. So here's premise number 1. Our governments should use their fiscal power during crises. Now, I guess extreme libertarians or extreme small government people could say that they don't think governments should do this. But I very much take the view that one of the reasons we have governments is to deal with big problems that are very difficult to deal with as a set of individuals. So this is me taking a normative position, saying, yes, I actually think governments should do this. Well, what sorts of crises have our governments, federal and provincial, dealt with? Well, in the First World War, the federal net debt increased by 42 percentage points. Yeah, wow, that's a big number. 42 percentage points. The net ratio, debt-to-GDP ratio, increased by 42. During the Great Depression, up by 35 points. So those are 2 very different shocks or crises. One is a military crisis. The second is very much an economic and social crisis. But the federal government was in there. Second World War, 70 percentage points. Okay, I'll show you a little bit later the graph of the federal government's net debt. And of course, it spikes in 1945 at a huge number. Now we're into Fed and provincial because it's more modern data. The 2008 financial crisis, much smaller. I mean, still a big event. If you remember the language, the rhetoric around the fall of 2008 and the collapse of Lehman Brothers and the financial crisis that ensued, this was viewed as a major event. The recession that we had was only about 2.8 or 3% of a decline of GDP during 2009. Wasn't anything like the size of the Great Depression, as it turned out. Part of that, I would argue, was because of the policy response. But still a pretty big event. And of course, the COVID pandemic, most of this was federal, but provincial was in there as well. Net debt ratio, the combined Fed plus Prov, up 22 percentage points, okay? So I'm just going to ask you to remember that number because it's going to come back, okay? So that is a pretty big shock. It's not the biggest shock we've had here. If you think about World War II as one shock, maybe it's multiple shocks over 5 years. I'm not quite sure how we want to define shocks. But so that's not the biggest one on the slide, but it's pretty big and come back to it. Okay, premise number 2. It follows from premise number 1, that's what that arrow is for. It follows from premise number 1 that governments need to maintain their ability to borrow at reasonable interest rates. So if governments are going to act in big ways in the face of some crisis, almost certainly it's going to be government spending of some sort, and that's probably not when you want to increase taxes. So that means we're going to have deficit-financed something. A deficit-financed war, a deficit-financed fiscal stimulus, deficit-financed health spending. But almost certainly this means increase in spending, not increase in taxes, which means borrowing, and then what you want to be able to borrow at reasonable rates. Well, so how do you make sure that governments get to borrow at reasonable rates? So those people here who are economists, and I think that's probably the majority, if not almost everybody, will remember this wonderful equation, the central equation of debt dynamics, where little d is the debt to GDP ratio, x is the primary deficit as a share of GDP, so that's the government's budget deficit excluding interest payments. R minus d is the crucial variable, the difference between the real interest rate on government debt and the growth rate of real GDP. R minus G a lot hinges on, and D, of course, is just the debt to GDP ratio. And so what this equation tells us is that the debt ratio has a life of its own. and that through our fiscal policy decisions, we can influence where the debt ratio goes, because our fiscal policy decisions are largely influencing X, the primary budget deficit. We can increase our spending or increase our taxes or decreases, or one of each, and that's going to affect X. But R minus G are largely out of control of the government, okay? And so we are sort of at the whim of R minus G. So debt dynamics can take on a life of its own, and you've got to think about that. So I'm going to come back to this. Monetary credibility, which really means a commitment to low inflation, also matters. Because if you have a central bank that is committed to keeping inflation low and stable, as we have had in Canada since the early 1990s, and many central banks, many countries have that, then that helps to keep inflation expectations low. And if inflation expectations are well anchored at a formal target, then that tends to keep, certainly keeps nominal interest rates on government debt low, but it also even tends to keep real interest rates on government debt lower, okay? Because there's an element of uncertainty that is no longer there if expectations are well anchored. And if the risk premium on government debt, so if government debt, the debt ratio starts to rise, starts to be viewed as too high, and or there's a perception that the central bank may produce higher inflation in the future, and therefore the bonds that are overwhelmingly transacted in nominal terms will then be worth less to the bondholder, then you start getting risk premia starting to rise on those government bonds. And when those start to rise, so once the bondholders start to believe that either the government can't really pay this stuff back, or they're going to pay it back with depreciated currency, then they start to not want to hold these bonds as assets. That starts to drive down bond prices, starts to drive up the risk premium. And at that point, the government that is trying to borrow doesn't really want to borrow at escalated interest rates. And so that forces what I'm calling forced austerity. And I would say that Canada in 1995 was a pretty good example of this. And Greece in 2011 was an even better example of this. And Greece in 2011, it's almost as if the financial markets in early 2010, after a Greek election, kind of woke up and realized the debt dynamics equation. And they looked at the debt dynamics equation. For Greece, the debt to GDP ratio in the spring of 2010 was about 180%. And it was almost as if financial markets sort of woke up one day and said, holy smokes, we've done the math. Greece can't pay this stuff back. And so their bond yields spiked, and it forced austerity into the for the Greek government. And the Greek government then was cutting their spending significantly and raising their taxes, both of which are, of course, very unpopular and brought people out onto the streets. And Greece went through 5 years of Great Depression level economic contraction. 5 years. So from 2009 through 2015, something like that, they had a 30% decline. Okay? Canada, of course, was not nearly as bad, but when we hit the debt wall, which was the expression that was used at the time, in late 1994 and early 1995, that basically pushed the federal government, Finance Minister Paul Martin, backed by his Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, into the 1995 federal budget, which was the beginning of a very substantial fiscal consolidation, most of which was a decline in government spending. And we got large government deficits turned into substantial budget surpluses within a very short amount of time, a few years. But that hurts. That hurts. So that's premise number 2, that we have to keep the debt to GDP ratio to a level where the bondholders are happy to buy those bonds, safe and secure in the knowledge that you're going to pay them back and you're not going to inflate them away, and therefore there's a very low or zero risk premium or very low risk premium on those bonds. Premise number 3. After a crisis in which you borrow a bunch of money and incur a bunch of debt, we should, again, this is now me making a normative statement, we should reduce the debt to GDP ratio quickly. Why? Not because I love fiscal austerity, but because we've got to get ready for the next crisis. Because you never know when the next crisis is going to happen. You never know when it's going to happen. You never know what it's going to be. You don't know how costly it's going to be. And so if you really believe in the ability and the power, or the value, I suppose, of the government using its fiscal power to address these issues, then you want to make sure that they are available to address the next issue. So the more fiscal prudence you want, the quicker should be that reduction in the debt to GDP ratio following a crisis. The problem is there is short-term pain here for the long-term gain. The short-term pain is the trimming of the spending and the raising of the taxes. Okay, so that's what Greece was doing, but they weren't trimming, by the way. Okay, but if you're going to cut government spending, it's going to have a short-run impact that is painful for somebody. Even though it might be a long-run great thing to do, it is going to hurt somebody. Terminating some programs, causing some layoffs, in the short run, a negative multiplier effect on the economy. Raising taxes is going to do the same thing. So economic and political costs. Short-run economic costs, I don't know what the run is on the political costs, but there is a reason why governments don't like doing this. Because nobody wants to be the one standing up talking about government cuts or increase in taxes. They'd much rather be saying exactly the opposite. So it's easy in this situation. You've used the government to use its fiscal power to address a crisis. And then now doing premise number 3, just you kind of like to say, we've done our thing, let's be lazy. We don't have to work too hard to get ready for the next one. The next one will be far away. The next one might even be after I'm no longer in office. So the electoral cycle probably isn't helping us in terms of taking the long view. So this is what I call fiscal complacency. Okay? Fiscal complacency. Premise number 4. Taxpayers generally want to receive current services equal to or greater than, but at least equal to their current taxes. Okay? So here I'm now playing a little amateur psychology. I know that I am, and I'm more amateur than an amateur psychologist, okay? But there's a reason why things like this are unpopular. So one thing that's unpopular is when debt service payments become large. When debt service payments become large, and today at the federal level, they're about 10% of total spending. Well, I don't think that means much to people. 10% of total spending, most people don't think about how big federal spending is, so 10% of federal spending. But you then say, oh, it's actually more than our health transfers to all the provinces. People kind of go, ooh, really? So the feds are spending X on annual transfers to keep our healthcare system running. And most people, of course, don't know the small contribution by the feds for the very expensive healthcare system. But still, they think of the feds giving money to the provinces to help operate the healthcare system, and wow, we're spending more on interest payments than we're spending on that, or more than twice what we're spending on defense. Now, during the good days in Canada, nobody knew anything about how much we spent on defense, and nobody talked about it. Well, that's changing. Okay? That's changing, and we'll come back to that. So this is an unpopular situation. When interest payments get large enough that it just seems too large, because people know that they're not getting today's services from their interest payments. And I think maybe they forget or never realize that, well, their interest payments today are for debt incurred in the past, and they got good things with the debt in the past. That's maybe too complicated an argument. I don't like to think that, normal people are unsophisticated, but maybe economists just think people are too clever. I don't know. Here's something else that's unpopular: large and sustained budget surpluses. Well, kind of for the same argument, right? If the government is reporting large budget surpluses year after year after year, then it doesn't take very long for people to say, well, hold on, so your budget surplus is money that's more than you're spending, which means you don't need it to finance current programs, so what are we getting for it? Oh, you're reducing the stock of debt? That kind of suffers the same problem that the first one does. And we had this discussion in the early 2000s. So after Paul Martin designed those set of budgets that got us from very large budget deficits down to balanced budgets and then surpluses, Jean Chrétien started talking about how are we going to spend the fiscal dividend? Do you remember that? How are we going to spend the fiscal dividend? We've got all this money. How are we going to spend it? Well, as soon as you spend it, you no longer have a surplus, right? I mean, let's make sure we understand that. But still, it was because if you have large surpluses, there's just political pressure to do something with them, because it shows a misalignment from what we're paying relative to what we're currently getting in services. So that's premise number 4. And I think what it implies is premise number 5, which is it's difficult to have large and sustained reductions in nominal debt, okay, in the actual stock of nominal debt after a crisis. You can have a little bit, but you probably can't have, again, my amateur psychology, you probably can't have large amounts for multiple years. Reductions in nominal debt. So I went back to the data and said, well, how much did nominal debt fall in the years after World War I? Well, between 1922 and 1930, it only fell by 10%. That's not that much. That's a few years of budget surpluses, and they're not even that big budget surpluses. This isn't 10% of GDP, it's just 10%. 1946 to 1958. Now, this is a period where, and I'm going to show you in a second, the debt-to-GDP ratio massively fell from its wartime peak to the low in the early 1970s. Quite a striking diagram. But it wasn't much of a reduction in nominal debt. It only fell by 15%. 96 to 2008, so these are Paul Martin. The first part of this period was Paul Martin, and then we get into the just before the financial crisis, fell by 16%. Huge fiscal consolidation. If I showed you government spending as a share of GDP, it fell by 7 percentage points. It was a huge fiscal adjustment from 1995 to the early 2000s. Huge. But not much of a reduction in nominal debt. So the result of this is, if you buy this premise, I don't know whether this is the most contentious of them. No, you can decide which one is the most contentious. But if you buy this premise, then what we need to do is rely on primary surpluses, back to the debt dynamics equation, rely on primary surpluses and GDP growth to get the debt ratio down. That we can't we can't assume that following a crisis we can run some big surpluses for several years so that we can get nominal debt down. So here's that graph of the federal only, not federal plus provincial, but the federal debt to GDP ratio peaking at 110% just after World War II. And that massive reduction to the low point of about 16% in 1974-5, okay? And this part is the period period number 2, 1946 to 1958. There was fast nominal GDP growth. There were small deficits and some small surpluses. So very little happened that was exciting in terms of reductions of nominal debt. But what we had was fast GDP growth, fast nominal GDP growth. Okay, so I put all of this together, and what do I get? Well, what I get is back to this diagram. So now let me build this diagram from the logic of these 5 premises. So there is the federal plus provincial net debt to GDP ratio. And that red period is what I'm, or the red region is what I'm calling the region of forced austerity. That's the region where bad things happen. And because bad things happen, we don't want to end up there. And we were there. The debt wall, we hit the debt wall in late 1994, early 1995. This was when, this was shortly after, like immediately after, the Mexican, what was sometimes called the tequila or the peso crisis, which was December of 1994. And I think really what happened there is that when there is a financial crisis someplace in the world, and Mexico was pretty close, asset managers around the world start rethinking their portfolio. And you know the expression, the flight to quality, right? So people get out of Mexican assets and they, where's the ultimate quality? The ultimate quality was and still is US Treasuries. But as they're flowing toward US Treasuries, they also decide to get out of any place else that's looking a little sketchy. And at that time, the Canadian government debt was looking a little sketchy, okay? And so people start dumping, bondholders start dumping Canadian bonds. The bond prices go down, the bond yields go up, which all happened in early 1995. And they're dumping the Canadian bonds. They're also dumping the Canadian dollar to get into US Treasuries or something else, so the Canadian dollar depreciates. So that's what happened. Paul Martin's first budget was in the 94 budget. They got elected in 1993. 94 was their first budget, which was kind of a do-nothing, kind of nothing to write home about budget. But the 95 budget was forced by these events. And that was the beginning of the very serious fiscal consolidation. So we hit the debt wall there. And so what I did is I just arbitrarily said, look, let's take that as the event that we remember, and let's just come down 4 or 5 percentage points from that, quite arbitrarily, as the region, kind of the beginning of that zone. So anything close to that is going to be when bad things start to happen. The problem is that border depends on the underlying debt dynamics. The higher is R minus G, so the higher is R relative to G. So remember, R is the real rate on government bonds, and G is the rate of growth of real GDP. So the higher is the gap between R and G, the more debt takes on its own life rising, the debt ratio. So the higher is R minus G, the lower that border is. The bad things start sooner, in other words. And then you can say, well, is there an effect of the debt ratio itself on the growth rate of the economy? So this takes us to Reinhardt and Rogoff's famous paper. So if you haven't read this paper, I encourage you to read it. 2010 AER, incredibly well-cited paper. I think the reason is because, number one, it was simple, and number two, it fed into a pretty tense political debate happening in 2010, which was happening in the US after the midterm elections in 2010, when the Tea Party got in, and in Europe when the sovereign debt crisis in Europe was just getting underway. And so there was a lot of discussion about, well, does high government debt actually slow down the growth in the economy? Are these two things related at all? Reinhardt and Rogoff wrote this paper where, I think I would say this to them, so I'll say this to you now. I think it was a pretty sloppy paper, okay? Which is one of the reasons I put it on my reading list for my students. I want them to read the paper and know that not everything that gets published in the AER is really good, okay? It's a pretty sloppy paper, but it's a very interesting paper. What they basically do is show that there's a correlation between growth rates and debt ratios. Basically say, once your debt ratio, the correlation, I'll speak as if there's causality, but there's not causality in their study. There's correlation. That countries that have a debt ratio above 90% are, tend to be countries with lower growth rates. Okay, I think I said that right. Okay, that's correlation. They talk about it as if it's causality, but it's correlation. But it's nonetheless, it's an interesting correlation, okay? Well, if there is a causal relationship, if in fact higher debt does cause a lower growth rate, then you want to think about that as well. Because the lower is the growth rate, the bigger is the gap between R minus G, and then the more that those debt dynamics kick in, and they kick in against you, okay? So that's the forced austerity. Then we are to the fiscal complacency zone. So what is the fiscal complacency? This is the zone that you're not in the bad area, you're not in that red area of forced austerity, but you are close enough that if you were hit by a big shock, your debt ratio, and you wanted to address that big shock by borrowing, your debt ratio would go back up and you'd be in the red area, and then bad things would happen. That's the problem with the yellow zone. So how big is the yellow zone? So what I did, remember the 22 points of COVID? So COVID was an increase of federal plus provincial debt ratio of 22 points. So I said, well, let's be one COVID away. Like, let's think about COVID as a big shock. And then I thought, well, I'm not sure COVID is a big shock in the world that we're now moving into. So I picked a super COVID, okay? And completely arbitrarily, I added 6 points, okay? I added 6 points to the actual 22, and I said, okay, 28 is going to give us protection against the COVID shock, and then some. And the problem is we might be in a world now, and it kind of feels like we are in a world now, of multiple crises. So our next shock might be the combination of a financial crisis and a war, or a war and a pandemic, or a pandemic and a financial crisis, or any one of those three and something else. And so the kind of more you think the world is messy and that we are shock prone, or that we live in a world full of shocks or susceptible to shocks, the more you probably want a buffer, which means that boundary comes down, down, down. So the yellow zone gets bigger, and the safe zone, the green zone, which is where I could have just called that the safe zone, okay? But to me, the green zone is where you can claim that you are being fiscally prudent. You're fiscally prudent in the green zone because you are a super COVID shock, or maybe a little bit more, away from the forced austerity. And that's what you're really trying to avoid, is the forced austerity. Now, a few extra things before I wrap up. 4 extra thoughts. Number one, there's a lot of discussion about sustainable debt. So is that the same thing as what I'm calling prudent or prudence? Number 2, risk versus uncertainty, because I think that's relevant, if there are any Frank Knight fans in the audience. Number 3, are there costs of reducing the debt ratio? I've hinted at this already, I'll just say a little bit more. And how about our future spending needs? Okay, because, so this is, what kinds of demands might we be encountering in the near future, and what does that mean for our fiscal situation? So, is sustainable the same thing as prudent? Well, the short answer is no. Okay, so here the question is, now the PBO, the Parliamentary Budget Office, talks about debt sustainability, and they talk about today's debt being sustainable. And you think, okay, that's interesting. What does sustainable mean? Sustainable means, in their analysis, it means that the debt ratio is not expected to rise along current spending and tax plans. Okay? So if you take your current spending plans and your current tax plans out into the future, so current fiscal policy, then the debt ratio is not going to rise. So what they're really looking at is that debt dynamics equation and saying the dynamics here aren't bad. But that's with current fiscal policy. So this is quite different than what I'm talking about. Okay, I'm neither, I don't disagree or agree with their assessment of sustainability. To me, prudent is quite a different concept. which is the debt ratio is low enough now so that you are safe from some future shock. Okay? So that if that future shock happens, you can handle it fiscally, you can increase your debt to GDP ratio to handle that shock, and you won't get into the red zone. Okay? So I think these are two quite different concepts. Okay, risk versus uncertainty. How does this enter into this? Well, if there are any lovers of Frank Knight or followers of Frank Knight, he was the one who talked a lot about the difference between risk and uncertainty. So my central argument here is based on fiscal prudence, that there's value in reducing the debt ratio now so that you are able to deal with future crises. Which then kind of naturally leads to this question, right? But how likely are those future crises to happen, right? And how big are they likely to be? I think economists here would love to attach a probability. Okay, what are the kinds of things that can happen? What are the probabilities? What are the dollar values of those events? And then, you know, I can write down some expected value or something like that. Economists love to do that. Well, and if economists were dealing with a world of risk, that would be a perfectly reasonable thing to do. But I think we're in a world of uncertainty. And Frank Knight made the distinction between risk and uncertainty, that uncertainty is a situation where in both risk and uncertainty, you don't know what the future holds. But in a world of risk, you know what the possible outcomes are, and you probably know what the probabilities are. So if you go to a casino and you play roulette, that is a game of risk, okay? But the world we are living in, I would argue, is not a world of risk, it's a world of uncertainty. We don't know. I mean, how many people here today think with any success you could predict the kinds of things that will come out of Donald Trump's mouth in the next month? Hey, if you go back to the election, I don't think anybody would have predicted some of the things that he has said and some of the things that he is apparently pushing in the month and 4 days that he's been president. Okay? So we live in a world where we don't know how the future unfolds. We don't even know what the possibilities are. We certainly cannot attach probabilities to them. And so that makes this whole thing just a lot more difficult. Right? Coming up with a precise number for the expected benefits or the expected costs, I think is very hard, if not impossible to do. What are the costs of debt reduction? Well, back to our central equation of debt dynamics, what does reducing the debt ratio involve? Well, you can either reduce the primary budget deficit, that's X, so you can either reduce spending or you can increase taxes. You could increase the growth rate of real GDP, okay? You could reduce the real rate on government debt. The problem is governments don't have a growth rate of real GDP as a policy variable, right? When I was at the Department of Finance for 18 months, nobody showed me the room where if you opened up that room and went in, there was a lever that you could pull to speed up the growth rate of real GDP. Now, maybe it's there, but maybe I just didn't have security access to that room. But I believe that room does not exist, okay? So that's not a policy lever, okay? It's certainly a policy aspiration, but it's not a policy lever. And the real rate on government debt is also not a policy lever. I mean, when you decide to sell bonds as a government and borrow money, if you're going to sell those in the capital markets, you are going to hopefully, be able to sell those at a high price and a low yield. But it doesn't always work out that way. So the things that the government can really influence are these two things. You can reduce your spending, you can increase your taxes, but those things have short-term costs. Okay? And they are both, as I said before, both political and economic costs. And so I don't mean to suggest that a government that wants to reduce its debt to GDP ratio so that it can, be ready to deal with future challenges. I don't mean to suggest that that is a costless decision. It isn't a costless decision, okay? And that's exactly why we get fiscal complacency, because people say, oh, that's going to hurt if we do that. It's going to hurt either in terms of short-run economic contraction, or it's going to hurt in terms of political unpopularity, probably both. So it's much easier to be complacent. So there are short-term costs here, but there are the long-term benefits, which are improved access to borrowing for when that next crisis happens. And the final comment is, in some sense, kind of what's the motivation for all of this? Like, do I really think we're entering into a world where we're going to have to spend a lot more and so we have to worry about all of this? Well, here's my list. These are certain or near certain. Near certain is a little bit of a weasel term. Expenditure increases. Number one, rising healthcare spending. Well, that has been happening. The aging of the baby boom. The baby boomers, the oldest baby boomers left the labor force, or turned 65, in 2011. Okay? I'm 62, so I'm basically the tail end of the baby boom. And as that baby boom gets older, what do? Well, they retire at some point, and then they hang out and they, curl or whatever. In parts of the country, curling very big, not in all parts of the country. But then they throw out their arm curling, so they enter the healthcare system, okay, and they get sick, and we spend a lot of money on people who are sick, seniors who are sick. I mean, seniors get way more health dollars spent on them per person than younger people, way more, hardly surprising. Well, that's going to increase. That is going to increase healthcare spending by some government in Canada by about 3 percentage points over the next 20 years. 3 percentage points of GDP. Not the end of the world, but you got to think about it. You got to build that into the fiscal framework. Has that been fully built in? Technological change is interesting in the healthcare sector. Technological change, in steel or in computers or in, stereo equipment, or I've just dated myself with that expression. But technological change in most things drives down prices. Not in healthcare. It might drive down a price, but it doesn't drive down expenditure. When we invent a way to save somebody's life, what do? We use it. So all of a sudden we say, hey, we've got this technology thing that can save 10,000 lives that we couldn't save before. So what do? We save 10,000 lives. That's what we do. It's what we're always going to do. So technological change actually tends to drive up healthcare spending. Rising income support for the elderly. This is the single largest item on the federal budget. Single largest item on the federal budget. OAS and GIS. Single largest item, and growing quickly with the aging of the baby boom. Okay? Healthcare is the single largest item on the provincial budget and the fastest growing. Okay? Rising public investments for green transition. So the first two, notice there's no question mark in the first two. They're happening for sure. The third one, rising public investments for green transition. Well, I don't know if that's going to happen or not, but I suspect there will be a fair amount of public dollars spent of various kinds. It might be east-west electricity grids. It might be public subsidies for hydrogen development or for carbon capture and storage. There's all kinds of ways that we can, or more subsidies to electric battery producers, EV battery producers. So we don't know exactly what's going to happen there, but my guess is there's going to be a fair amount of spending. Rising public investments to replace aging infrastructure. I think this is one that we're not really talking about much, because I won't say most, there's a huge amount of infrastructure in this country and in many countries that was built in the immediate post-war period. And that infrastructure has a life, and kind of we're getting close to the end of it. I live in Montreal. I don't know if you have driven through Montreal lately, but Montreal is a city where the infrastructure falls by the ton. okay? The overpasses, it's very scary. When you see the overpasses and there's a steel mesh, like just imagine this is a concrete beam in an overpass, and you're under the overpass, and there's a steel mesh, which is fairly rusted, and it's keeping everything up. Because before that steel mesh was put in place 5 years ago, the stuff was falling down in chunks. We have a lot of that in Quebec, okay? I see way less of that in Western Canada, way less of that in Ontario. But there's lots of aging infrastructure in this country. And we did a whole bunch of new infrastructure in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. It's getting old, it's gonna need replacing. And that's kind of like, will that be good for the economy? Yes, clearly, but in a weird, measured sense. It's kind of like when you get a crack in the foundation of your house, and so you have to fix the foundation. So you spend $25,000 to fix the foundation of your house. So what did you get for that? Nothing very exciting, right? It's not like a new deck, or a beautifully redone kitchen. It's just, okay, now I know that my house isn't going to fall down. Well, that's a good thing. Okay, well, so now I know that the bridge isn't going to fall down. But, it's not going to increase productivity. As long as the bridge was standing, it was still taking traffic, and now it's just a new bridge. So you don't get a very satisfying payoff from that, but it's something you've got to do. Ooh, well, here's something that we haven't been talking about much in this country, and we now are talking about it in this country. It might be security spending, to secure the border, or it might be more conventional military spending. So are we going to get pushed to 2% commitments for NATO, or 2.5%, or 3%? What are we going to do about Ukraine? Do we feel that there is a serious annexation threat? I mean, I hope not, but it's kind of hard to ignore a US president that talks about annexation. So I don't think anybody thinks we're going to do less spending on this item in the next 20 years, and probably we're going to do a lot more spending. Protection of Arctic sovereignty, we're talking about more now than we probably ever have before. It's probably a good thing. China is not really an Arctic country, but they kind of are, because they say they are, and therefore maybe they are. And Russia absolutely is an Arctic country, and Russia and China, if you read the news today, they are absolute BFFs, right? They are best friends, and who knows whether they're going to show up in the Northwest Passage. And then, of course, addressing the threat of US tariffs. So there's discussion about maybe the tariffs will not come to pass, maybe they will, maybe they'll be focused on steel and aluminum, maybe they'll be on everything, maybe they'll be at 25%, maybe they'll be higher, maybe they'll be lower. Nobody knows anything. But there is at least some discussion about, or there was a couple of weeks ago, by the federal government about having a pandemic-style relief packages, right, to help individuals or businesses through a period that, if those tariffs come to pass, will be very negative for large parts of the Canadian economy. So that will cost money if we do something like that. Tough to design those in a sensible way, it seems to me, but still, that might be a big expenditure item. If, I don't know what your view is on taxation, but you could say, okay, well, those are spending things, we better spend them. But then you say, where are you going to get the money from them? Where are you going to get the money from for those things? Well, you could just raise taxes, but then you run up against this concern that maybe we have reached the limit of taxation, or maybe at least we've reached the limit on some taxes. I'm not sure you'd want to put corporate taxes much higher in a world where the United States is talking about further reductions in corporate taxes, because you have to worry about the mobility of capital and all of those concerns. And I haven't mentioned the fact that Canada's got terribly low productivity levels and slow growth rate in productivity. And while it is difficult to come up with just, one cause of that, I think most people agree, most economists agree, that slow investment in Canada and a low amount of capital per worker in Canada is one of the key things. So if you need more capital per worker, that means you need more business investment, and one of the ways that you probably would not want to attract business investment is higher corporate tax rates. So you can have a big debate about whether we have reached our limits of taxation. But to me, what this means, my conclusion from this is really we need to do a serious exercise in program evaluation. And here I'll mention Paul Martin again. So Paul Martin in the mid-1990s instituted program review, capital P, capital R, program review, which was a pretty deliberate, unemotional, analytical review of programs, department by department. And they went through, and this is where when I first heard Paul Martin say the quote that I use every year in my classes, government should only do what only government can do. Write that down. That's a good statement. Government should only do what only government can do. Two onlys. Government should only do what only government can do. That's actually a great way to kind of organize your thinking. It's a recognition that there's some things that governments do really well and that markets do terribly. And there's some things that markets do terribly and governments do very well. And so let's figure out what we need to do. And governments don't need to produce Snickers bars because the market does that pretty well. But the government probably could provide national defense a lot better than anything else. So how do you figure out, go through those programs, review them, evaluate them. Are they working well? Could they work better? Do we even need them? Using the sort of Paul Martin quote. And this is a very unflashy thing for governments to do. No minister gets to go up to a ribbon and cut it and go, hey, we're going to have program review, right? That's just not a very good photo op. But it's a super important thing to do if you want to say, well, these are all pretty high priority things, and maybe we could identify some of the low priority things and stop doing them. Because if you don't want to do that, if you're going to keep doing the low priority things and you're going to do the high priority things, then you're going to go perhaps beyond the limits of our taxation. And that's going to produce the problems that come from high marginal tax rates in various places. And this isn't so easy. Only about 25% of the federal budget is easily discretionary. More of it is discretionary. But some of it, for example, health payments to the provinces, health transfers to the provinces, well, you could reduce that, but that's not so easily discretionary. Defense is more easily discretionary, I would say, than health transfers. Okay? So 25% is $125 billion. Well, there's a fair amount of money there. But it requires going through those programs and reviewing them and finding out how things go. Okay, so the summary. I would argue that there's enormous value in being able to access borrowing on a large scale to deal with the crises that inevitably will be in our future. But this requires prudence in the wake of crises, getting that debt to GDP ratio back down to that safe zone or the fiscally prudent zone, the green zone. But it's really very easy to be complacent when you're in the yellow zone. You can't be complacent in the red zone, by the way. The red zone forces you into austerity because no government wants to be borrowing. In the worst part of Greece's forced austerity, the yields on their 2-year bonds were 85%, right? I mean, and that's when the government says, well, we can't do that. So then they turn to the IMF, right? And the IMF says, partly because of arguments from our finance minister at the time, no, you guys don't need the IMF. You're a bunch of rich European countries. Solve your problems yourself, okay? But anyway, so then they go to Germany and the Dutch, and the Germans and the Dutch are kind of fiscally responsible, or at least they have that brand, and so it forces more fiscal adjustments on the Greeks. So that was not pretty. So you can't be complacent when you're in the red zone. Your hand is forced. But in the yellow zone, it's just so easy to be complacent. And you can just hope that there won't be a shock. You can hope that just good old natural growth, natural debt dynamics will reduce the debt to GDP ratio. And that's kind of what our government has been doing. If you follow the last 5 or 6 budgets, there's a graph of the debt to GDP ratio. And it always shows a nice downward path over the next 5 or 6 years. But every subsequent budget, it's bumped up, bumped up, bumped up. So it's still downward sloping, but it bumps up, bumps up, bumps up. And spending, of course, is bumped up, bumped up. So that's the complacency. And so I would argue that we are in that situation today of too much complacency. And so I guess what I'm advocating is experiencing, sacrificing, tolerating some of those short-run costs in terms of reduced spending and or higher taxes, but I would focus on the spending, so that we get the longer-run benefits that come with the lower debt-to-GDP ratio, so that we can be ready for the next shock when it happens, because it's going to happen. And maybe it's already happening. So I'll stop there and take any questions. Thank you.
You're good handling your own questions.
I will handle my own questions, and we'll see if I'm good at it. Let's see. I am okay to handle my own questions. Yes.
Why do they call economics the dismal science? All right. Why do they call economics the dismal science? No, we're very excited in Peterborough. The Liberals have just announced a high-speed train between Toronto and Montreal. This is
Coming through
here.
Peterborough, I noticed.
So if you're prepared to wait 15 or 20 years, the next time you visit, it'll be a lot easier. But Justin justifies this, expenditure as an investment, increasing G. So sometimes government spending, you've been sort of talking about government spending as today's spending, but there's also an investment aspect to it that will help us with your problem.
Well, and so it's a good example, and the other example on the same point is Mark Carney's announcements about effectively capital budgeting, right? So he's saying, let's have the government spend less so that we can all invest more, and he's talking about splitting up the budget in a way that, as I understand it, is already split up. I mean, we already see investment items treated differently in the government's budget. So I'm not quite sure actually how his proposal is different from the status quo, because I thought we were already doing that. But the basic point, I think, is completely in favor of public investment here. And in fact, I actually think that public investment, I actually think that capital markets, the bondholders, treat spending on investment differently than spending on consumption. Another way to say that is not all increases in the debt to GDP ratio are viewed the same way by bond markets. And the thing that I remember here is in the year or two following the financial crisis, Ireland and Spain, if I remember correctly, both used public funds to take over failed financial institutions. And it was a pretty significant bump in their debt to GDP ratio, but they kind of nothing happened in the bond markets. And my interpretation of that was that the bond market said, okay, well, you're buying this asset, right? You're using all of this money to buy this asset. That's very different than using this money to spend on current salaries. And so they responded differently. So maybe that's a bit too much amateur psychology again from me. But I do think the government, I'm all in favor of government investment of the right kind, okay? My concern about what Mark Carney is saying is that as soon as you say, we will balance the operating budget, but we will borrow to finance investment, which in general is a good idea, okay? If you're going to build a high-speed train that's going to last for 100 years or however long, and it's going to generate benefits for a few future generations, then to me the logic is, well, those future generations can pay for it too then, right? So actually borrowing to finance that seems perfectly sensible. So that principle, it seems to me, is very sound. But when you practically apply it, I think you very quickly then get into a situation where you say, okay, now I have to define every item as either consumption or investment. And how are we going to do that? So how about military? So how about tank shells? Not the tank, although they might be almost as disposable as the shells. right? But a tank shell or ammunition in general, is that an investment? It's kind of the ultimate military consumable, right? So what is that? Are we going to call all defense investment? So you get into these accounting problems, and what you hope is you don't end up playing political games with them. Oh, we'll just call that investment and investment and investment, and then we won't reduce the deficit at all. That's my concern.
I'm just going to interject for anybody online, because there are some people online. If they wanted to put in a question, they can just email community speaker series at Trent U, which is on our poster. So I just wanted to put that in, and I will watch the inbox for any questions from there.
Thank you very much. I was a little bit surprised when you said that when you were working in the Department of Finance and you're, metaphorically looking for the room or the lever to crank up economic growth, you couldn't find it. And
You thought that was a metaphor. I'm just telling you the truth, man. I mean, nobody showed me the closet.
And I understand that to mean that you don't believe that the government has a real role in spurring economic growth.
I did not mean that at all.
Okay, well, please, then clarify what you
So
meant.
what I meant is that the growth rate, look, it's kind of the holy grail of policy objectives for government. Governments, like through time and space, governments want to come up with ways to increase the growth rate. But there's absolutely not, a lever that you can do it. So governments have all kinds of ideas. Oh, lower the corporate tax rate, lower the gap between the small business tax rate and the big business tax rate, fund public education, more research funding to universities, right? I mean, if you know this area, then you know that there's 1,000 stories that will conceivably lead to higher growth rates. But none of them are very easy. I mean, I think growth is sort of the holy grail. It's the thing that we know it matters. And we also know that we do not know where it comes from.
But my question here is where I'm challenged is how can you really do that without expanding the fiscal deficit? Because I'm just looking at the United States, whether it's the Inflation Reduction Act, whether it's the infrastructure bill, whether it's the many $1 trillion that they passed in the just really last 2 to 3 years, right? All of it is basically government debt. But the problem is also that kind of comes back to the question of if the 10-year Treasury gives you a 5% yield, why do I buy a Canadian bond? And so I think that's like as an international investor, not as a Canadian. Like if we're trying to get more money so that we're able to maybe at least comparable to our population size match American investment, then I think we need to become more kind of popular in the bond market internationally and not just domestically. Am I correct or incorrect?
Okay, let me go to the first part of that where you said, how can we do that? I think you meant, how can we get higher growth without more fiscal spending by governments? Well, I guess my response to that would be, well, I can imagine some public spending that will enhance growth, but I can also imagine lots of public spending that won't. So, I think public spending on defense actually is a darn good idea if you happen to be in a war, but I don't think we should expect it, except maybe through technological change that gets pushed through the military spending, maybe to increase productivity growth or growth rate of the economy. Except in the short run multiplier effects. But in the long run, I see no particular reason why a long run growth rate of the economy should be influenced by all government spending, but it's going to be influenced by some government spending.
But is there no, I don't want to hog the conversation, so I'll end here, but is there no kind of a risk growth nexus? So my background is not economics. I read economics, but I did not study it formally. My background is
There's still
engineering.
time.
My background is engineering, and I look at the program, the Program Loans Office at the Department of Energy in the United States, a $400 billion investment in risky companies that could yield high growth. Tesla, SpaceX, quite a few others were recipients of that loans programs. Can Canada do something similar, comparable to its size?
We do. We do.
But I don't.
So this is not my specialty, but we've got lots of programs where we have government, or it's either government directly or it's a crown corporation, BDC, EDC, the Canada Growth Fund, providing the infrastructure bank, providing financing to companies, usually it's not the government taking an equity position. Usually it's the government either giving money or lending money. But they are basically trying to fill perceived gaps in the capital market and help these smaller businesses to have access to capital in the hopes that they will grow and become big. And guess what? Some of that works and some of it doesn't work. And I'm not arguing against those programs, but it's not, and that's true, by the way, in the United States, or they've got similar programs. I mean, most countries have similar programs, and they don't, not every loan works, right? And so that now opens up a much bigger question, which is, to what extent do you want or need government? Let me back up. The real question is, to what extent do you think capital markets aren't working very well? If you think your capital markets are actually working quite well, and that they're taking all the risks that they should be taking, then you don't need government to step in and fill any gaps, because there are no gaps. The capital markets are working well. And so some people are going to get credit and some people won't, and some people will survive, some businesses survive and some don't. I think the argument for, in fact, in Canada, the argument for the financial crown corporations, Export Development Canada, Farm Credit Corporation, CMHC, one other, are the belief that there are systematic gaps in the capital market. And if you can have the government in there providing access to capital in specific situations, then you can actually help things along. And those financial crown corporations have been around for years. And I think, broadly speaking, I think they're viewed as successful. Certainly nobody's talking about getting rid of them.
Okay, hello. Thank you so much for that talk. I worked for provincial government for 10 years, and I really appreciate you outlining just how difficult and challenging some of those decisions are between revenue and spending.
Is it just a randomly chosen provincial government, or maybe the one that we're in?
Manitoba.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. I married a woman from Manitoba.
Great place. And I actually remember the CHST and Paul Martin's budget way back in 1995. And, I appreciate your comments also, by the way, about investment in infrastructure. I guess my question is this, and it's kind of a policy wonk question, but at that time, because of the way that those services were then bundled to provinces to have discretion over spending, it meant that healthcare was funded, but some other programs for our most vulnerable people were not, because healthcare was just, a much more sort of well-supported voter set of programs. And so things like legal aid and services for women and children and our most vulnerable really took a hit. As you said, there's always that hurt. And so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on, we don't want to reach that point of austerity, obviously, but is there some way that we can start to build in buffers for those who are most vulnerable, especially now when we're seeing that those issues growing and growing in our communities?
Great question. And it reminds me of a conversation I had once with Jean Charest, because we know each other, we knew each other then. He was in the audience. I was telling the same thing I just said about Paul Martin's fiscal consolidation and why kind of in grand scheme of things this was good. We got our debt-to-GDP ratio down. And he came up to me afterward and he goes, yeah, I was the Premier of Quebec at that time. And let me tell you, I wasn't a very big fan of Paul Martin, right? Because one of the things that Paul Martin cut was transfers to provinces, and it downloaded the need for cuts and the need to make difficult and painful decisions onto the provinces. But they also made those decisions, right? I mean, so this is when at McGill, I remember this as the 94, 5, 6 period when transfers from the province to the universities was much smaller. So things were fiscally very, very tight in the universities. And of course they were tight this is when we, also had shortages of doctors and nurses, and we didn't fill them up again because, we were dealing with less money. So is there a way to build buffers in terms of what I would kind of say the social safety net. I'd be very broadly defined as a social safety net. I think you can, but you have to, building buffers is hard. I think building buffers is just hard for humanity, because building buffers is all about doing something today that you don't need today, but you're building that buffer for some rainy day in the future. And I think there's something about the human psyche, especially maybe the human psyche of elected officials, that says, no, we're not going to do that, right? We're going to deal with something when we have to deal with something. And so I think you can do that. It's just that you've really got to resist the sort of normal, I think, short-sightedness of most decision makers. I think that's a depressing answer. But, you know, when the fiscal stimulus package in the global financial crisis that happened, the fiscal stimulus package, as you will remember, in the budget of 2009 and 2010, the G20 countries, the leaders all met in Washington, D.C. in the fall of 2008, and they all came back to their national capitals, and they all said, okay, we're going to design fiscal stimulus packages, 3, 4, 5% of GDP, of mostly infrastructure spending, and it was going to be shovel-ready projects. Remember that language? Shovel-ready projects, right? So what does that mean? Well, you know, you're going to repave a road, you're going to build a new road, you're going to build a bridge, but is it shovel-ready? This is, so the myth here is that there exists in the Deputy Minister's Office of Infrastructure a filing cabinet with shovel-ready projects. Right? Here's a new bridge, here's a new port facility, here's a new airport, here's a new whatever. And they've all been designed and approved and environmentally cleared, and we're just ready to break ground tomorrow. Just as soon as a recession happens, boom, we'll do it. And that's just not how life is. But then that raises the question, well, why don't we do that? Why don't we have a bunch of shovel-ready projects ready to go, designed, approved, environmentally cleared, ethically cleared in every way that you need to clear them, and then just put them in the filing cabinet? Why don't we do that? Because we're humans and we don't do things like that. Maybe the Swedes do, I don't know. But we don't. So I think building buffers is, and that's what this is all about. This is building a buffer. And that's why it's hard, because we're saying, let's take a little bit of pain now, because you'll thank us, we'll all thank ourselves when the next crisis happens, and we'll be able to really use that fiscal power. But it's hard.
I wonder, Chris, I wonder if you could just do a quick review. Where does our debt-to-GDP ratio stand with respect to the other G7 countries? I understand we're in very good position.
We are. So I don't have data on this. Good question. So our debt-to-GDP ratio is lower than any other G7 country, okay? But it's very important. So nobody asked this question directly, but I'm going to introduce this. I thought about making this one of the further considerations. Why am I looking at net and not gross? Okay, because if you look at gross debt, Canada is still pretty good, but we're not better than everybody. But net debt, we are better than everybody in the G7, okay? Canada loves to talk about net debt. Chrystia Freeland never talks about any debt that isn't net debt, okay? The United States never talks about net debt. They always talk about gross debt. Why? So, and what's the difference? So gross debt is, you know, the bonds we have outstanding. What is getting netted out? What is getting netted out are things that are accumulated financial assets. So you think, okay, that sounds reasonable. If you've got a bunch of financial liabilities and you've got some financial assets, let's net them out. Well, the United States, what does Canada net out that's important? The more or less fully funded CPP and QPP funds, which amount to something like $800 billion, okay? So that's an asset sitting there. Now, of course, there's a liability against that asset too, right? As we all get older and we get our CPP, it's coming from that bucket of money. But we've got that bucket of money. And so we net it out against our gross debt. So as a result, our federal net debt ratio is, 42%. The United States has a Social Security system, more generous than our CPP, but it has basically no money in it, right? This is the third rail that nobody wants to talk about in the United States. Someday they're going to talk about it because they're going to have to talk about it. But they'll talk about it when they have to talk about it. But it's got more or less nothing in it. And so if they computed the same net debt calculation, they would end up at gross debt. So they love to talk about gross because they are not nearly as bad relative to others as they are with net. We love to talk about net because it's better. I could actually argue this both ways. I mean, it seems to me that there's got to be a difference between Canada and the US. If we've got a fully funded public pension system and they don't, somehow that should be accounted for in the numbers that we're looking at. But at the same time, I kind of think it's a little weird that we net out this stuff because it's not as if that's money sitting there with no calls on it. We know exactly who's going to call that money, and it's all of us. When we hit 65 or 70, whenever you decide to take your money, you're all going to get it. But the whole Canada versus G7 issue is something that, if I gave this talk to Chrystia Freeland, the first thing she would say is, our debt is fine relative to the G7 countries. Our debt is better or lower than all the G7 countries. And that's true, but I think that's not quite the right, to me that's a little too complacent. There is such a thing as US exceptionalism. And I think there's US fiscal exceptionalism as well. And so the US debt to GDP ratio is 100%. Their budget deficit this year is 7% of GDP. We used to have a 7% of GDP deficit back in the mid-1980s. We even had 8%. So our deficit is way lower. Our debt is way lower. But people will continue to buy US treasuries through thick and thin. History has shown us that. They will not necessarily continue to buy Canadian government debt through thick and thin. And so to me, that's the difference. And the real problem, you think about Greece. When did we know that Greece was in a problem? Well, we knew that Greece was in a problem when the bond markets woke up one morning and decided it was a problem. And that's the problem, is that you don't know when the bond holders or the bond buyers are going to wake up one day and say, you know what? I just don't want this stuff anymore. And they start dumping it, and the bond prices fall, and the yields spike, and then you're cooked. And so my whole thinking here is, okay, we just want to make sure we stay away from that. We want to give them no excuse. And I think Canada's case, yes, our debt to GDP ratio is in better shape than the other G7 countries. Maybe what that means is that I should just give this talk in 6 other languages too. I think they'd understand me in the United States and in the UK. I don't know about the other countries.
Okay, there's a question from the online audience. You are treating federal and provincial debt the same. However, they differ in a very significant way. The federal government has monetary sovereignty and can borrow money from itself, which is largely what it did to fund the extraordinary COVID spending. Do you reject the significance of this distinction? If so, why? And if not, does the story change when we acknowledge this distinction between federal and provincial debt?
Excellent question. No, it is true that at the federal level, we have a central bank, and that central bank can print money and use that printed money to purchase bonds, and that happened on a large scale during COVID, and the provinces don't have that. So there's absolutely a difference. But I squish them together because I also believe that bond markets, here's a little bit more amateur psychology, that bond markets sometimes believe that there's an implicit guarantee of provincial debt by the federal government. And so provincial debt and federal debt are sometimes viewed as similar. And back to this graph where we hit the debt wall. Where's that graph? There, right there. So if I wanted to do this analysis only with federal debt, then I would subtract out the provincial debt. But we still hit the debt wall in 1995. There was still a time when, there was still a red zone. There was still a time in 1995 when people were dumping our bonds, worried about our debt dynamics. And so to me, if I'm going to treat federal and provincial debt completely separately, and I take only the federal graph, so the federal graph goes up to about, at this point it was about 70%, okay, 72 maybe, then the red zone comes down to there as well. It's not going to fundamentally change the story, okay? The other thing I would just say about the central bank having the ability to buy government bonds, they clearly do, and they have the ability to buy provincial government bonds. In fact, they did some of that during COVID. But if the central bank is still committed to keeping inflation low, then that puts some constraints on the central bank, okay? But that then gets us into a big discussion about quantitative easing and whether that was appropriate during COVID. And I would be very happy to talk about that on another day. Very happy, because it's a great topic, great topic. Or we can do that, afterwards. Another question here, yes?
So just looking at that chart in the late 1990s, so when the feds downloaded expenses and cut revenues to the provinces, the next step in that was then the whole, in Ontario, they call it who does what, the whole review there of what the province does and what the upper tier and lower tier municipalities do. So then there was the extra trickle-down impact on that. And then the only other thing I wanted to say about the shovel-ready projects and how good it would be to have that drawer, you end up advancing projects that you could get shovel-ready by the deadline that may not have actually been your top priority or the best thing to be doing with that money at that point in time. You just, hey, we could whip this together, let's do this, even though it wasn't really, it was like our priority Z. So.
Okay, so I accept all of that. So you're absolutely right, that download from the feds to the provinces, then the provinces download to the cities, and so lots of cuts there. And you're quite right. If we adopt a rule, adopt a guideline that says we have to make sure the filing cabinet of shovel-ready projects is full, then the incentives are exactly that you will approve a bunch of dumb things. Well, not dumb, easy. But easy is often dumb. In fact, one of the things that I relearned or learned during my time at finance, during the global financial crisis and this fiscal stimulus package, is that it's extremely difficult to spend large amounts of money both quickly and well. You can do one or the other. You can just, you can hiss money away in large amounts on dumb things, or you can spend large amounts well, but you can't do that quickly. And my favorite example of this, back to Manitoba, because my wife is from Winnipeg, we go to Winnipeg a fair amount. And in 2009, there were the signs for the Economic Action Plan. At every place where there was federal infrastructure money on shovel-ready projects to get the economy moving again, there was a big blue and green Economic Action Plan sign. And so my wife's family lives in River Heights, and I was walking or biking or driving or something through River Heights and came up to this road, I think it was Grosvenor, and there's a long road that runs through this nice neighborhood, and it's one of the busier roads, but there's not businesses on both sides. It's just a slightly busier road. And all of a sudden, at every intersection with Grosvenor and whatever the other roads were, every intersection, maybe every second intersection, there was, which used to just be an intersection, was now an intersection with a concrete thing in the middle, which, if you hit, not good, but it was designed, I just can't imagine, who designed this. Because instead of driving through the intersection, maybe stopping or yielding or whatever, you have to drive around the concrete thing. And I thought, was this just to slow down traffic, or is this just because they needed some shovel-ready project, and wow, we could design this one in 5 minutes. And so it is still my favorite example of just dumb spending, but I'm sure there was some good spending too. But, okay, I'm getting the hook here. All right.
Well, we'd love to carry on all night, and in fact, I'm sure you can hang around casually for a few minutes.
Well, my train doesn't go back until next month sometime. So.
Exactly. So we want to thank you very much. Thank you for giving us much to think about. It's funny, this topic comes up again over time, and every time we have a good speaker, something new comes out, which is good food for thought. Thank you for giving us your time, and actually you gave more of it to the Via Rail Station in Dorval, but whatever, that's Canadian infrastructure. So to commemorate this great event, we offer each of our speakers a commemorative poster.
Oh, love it. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I like it.
Suitable for hanging in your office.
Thank
We
you.
have another one of those we'll put on our Hall of Fame. If you come visit us, I'll show you later where
Okay.
those go. So thank you all for coming out. We had an excellent audience tonight, some great questions. Very much appreciated. We'll see you all next year at an equally exciting and interesting talk.